Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's History Sandwiched In program. The opinions expressed today during the presentation are those of the speaker and are not those of the Wisconsin Historical Society or the Society's employees. Before we hand it over, I'm excited to introduce today's lecturer. We have Scott Lothis, who is presenting Railroads of Madison and South Central Wisconsin. Scott joined the staff of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art in 2008 and serves as its president and executive director. His deep interest in both railroads and landscapes came from his childhood in West Virginia, and he took up photography while attending college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. His work appears frequently in railroad magazines and other publications. He has contributed to 8 books of railroad photography and art. He and his wife, Maureen Muldoon, have lived in Madison since 2011. They reside on the city's west side with their dog, Alma. And with that, please join me in welcoming Scott Lothis for today's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here on this beautiful late September afternoon. It's an honor for me to take part in the Wisconsin Historical Society's History Sandwiched In series. Now, my presentation today is about railroads, and for most people, experiences with trains these days are somewhat rare. You might enjoy hearing a whistle across town on a warm summer evening, but many people only really think about trains if they get stuck behind one at a railroad crossing. But that wasn't always the case. Railroads helped build Madison and South Central Wisconsin into the city and the region that we know today, and they have left deep imprints. Even the few trains that still run, the ones that might stop you on John Nolan Drive, play an important role in the regional economy. Now, at their zenith, 9 different railroad lines fanned out from Madison, and in the early 20th century, more than 100 trains steamed through the city every day. Now, 7 of these lines remain in service, although only 4 still reach their original destinations, and none of them see anywhere close to as much traffic as they once did. We'll touch on all of these lines, and I'll come back to this map a lot. Before we go any further, though, I want to offer a disclaimer. Railroad history, like the history of any subject, is multidimensional. For more than a century, railroads touch nearly every facet of American life. And even today, when they roam mainly in the shadows of the landscape, trains are integral to the global supply chain. You can approach railroads from nearly any perspective: business, labor, race, gender, land use, geography, popular culture, and on and on. That's one of the many reasons why railroads have fascinated me for my entire life. This is a photograph by John Gruber, and I'll share more about him shortly. It shows the deployment of Wisconsin's 32nd Infantry Division by train from Madison in 1961 due to the Berlin crisis. The platform today is the glassed-in showroom for Motorless Motion's bicycles. Now, many historians approach railroads by focusing on their construction, particularly their financing and the personalities behind them. Both of those, financing and personalities, were often complicated and almost always interesting. This photograph shows construction of a new railroad line at Lebanon, Wisconsin in 1910. I have to imagine this might have been a Sunday outing for this family who posed next to the steam shovel in their church clothes. I think that's a great example of the public's fascination with railroads a century ago. Now, this isn't the same spot, but it is the same railroad line, and a photograph of my own taken a century later. This is Clyman Junction, Wisconsin, where the coaling tower still stands, a relic from the age of the steam locomotives. My main interest in railroads are how they've been used after they were built, how they relate to their surroundings, how they've changed over time, and why. And as a photographer, I try to interpret these stories visually. So that's the perspective I bring, and it's just one of many different perspectives you can apply to railroad history. None of the railroads in Madison or South Central Wisconsin arrived by accident. Each one was the result of a strategic and usually expensive project. Some of them exceeded their builders' expectations, others struggled, and all of them have changed. To understand why, we have to look beyond the city, to the regional, continental, and even international trends that have affected the railroads here. Now, I'll be illustrating my talk with a lot of photographs, including some of my own. Those appear without a credit line, like this one of a Wisconsin and Southern train crossing the Rock River at Edgerton in the fall of 2023. I also have some selections from the Wisconsin Historical Society, as well as the Library of Congress, and then quite a few from our archive at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, and those are all noted by their abbreviations. Now let me say a few words about the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Our mission is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. Railroads and photography came of age together in the 19th century. This is a glass plate from our Jim Shaughnessy collection. And they forged a visual relationship that is vibrant today. This is a 2019 photograph by Justin Franz, one of our board members, and it shows young and old photographers posing with Union Pacific's restored Big Boy steam locomotive at Ogden, Utah. Now, there are hundreds of railroad museums and historical societies, but the center is the only one with such a strong focus on the visual culture of railroading. And we also have a pretty unique business model. We don't have a museum or a gallery space of our own. We have a business office and an archival storage facility in Madison. And from them, we maintain a growing collection of more than 500,000 images that provide much of the material for everything we do. That includes preparing exhibitions that go to museums and galleries all over the country. This was our biggest, called Railroaders, which was at the Chicago History Museum from 2014 to 2016. We started with photographs by Jack Delano at the Library of Congress, and then we researched many of his portrait subjects to present a cross-section of railroad life in Chicago during World War II. And one of our principals for this project was Jack Holzheater, who worked at the Wisconsin Historical Society from 1964 until 2000. More recently, this is our exhibition about Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg, photographers, authors, and publishers at the Illinois Railway Museum in 2025. This was the 8th venue for this show since we produced it in 2018. And this is the opening reception for our latest exhibition, the Kalmbach Art Collection, with more than 50 paintings at Milwaukee's Groman Museum in May of 2025. We had nearly 250 people come out that night to see this show. In 2023, we partnered with the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation on a walking tour of what we call the West Rail Corridor in Madison between Monona Bay and West Washington Avenue. We really enjoyed working with the Trust, and this presentation grew out of a talk that I prepared for their virtual architecture series. The West Rail Corridor tour will be available again in 2026, and maybe I'll see some of you there. Now, getting back to our work at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, we also host conferences, events, and presentations. This is our annual conference at Lake Forest College, just north of Chicago, in 2025, our 3rd consecutive year with a sold-out crowd. We also make annual awards for creative imagery, and we publish books as well as a quarterly journal called Railroad Heritage. We're a nonprofit organization supported by our community of members. You can learn more about us on our website, railphoto-art.org. We're also on most of the major social media platforms at RailPhotoArt, including on YouTube, where you can watch dozens of our online presentations. Now, if you're wondering why we're in Madison, it's because our founder, John Gruber, lived here. John graduated from the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism, and he spent most of his career making publications for the university. He was a talented photographer, author, and researcher, and I'll be sharing many of his photographs. John perceived the need for a railroad organization focused on imagery. He did the work and he had the connections to get it off the ground. Along the way, we have attracted a tremendous all-volunteer board of directors from all over the country with a wide range of experience and expertise. And Madison has turned out to be a great location for us. It's a wonderful city, close to the nation's rail hub of Chicago, and we found several outstanding interns and staff members from the university's iSchool and elsewhere, as we've grown our team from 1 person to 10 in the time I've been here. So let's look at Madison. When Wisconsin became the 30th state in 1848, it had no railroads. In 40 years, less time than I've been alive, Madison's railroad map was complete. The first line here was an extension of the first railroad in the state, which joined Milwaukee and Waukesha in 1851. And it reached Madison 3 years later, coming up through Milton, Edgerton, Stoughton, and McFarland, and then across Monona Bay to reach the Isthmus. When the first train steamed into Madison in 1854, a crowd of 2,000 people greeted it. The city's population then was about 6,000, so proportionally that crowd was as big as a sold-out Camp Randall is today. The first depot was at West Washington Avenue, a railroad location we all still recognize. And here it is in 1873, looking east up Washington toward the Capitol, and you can see a corner of the depot at left. When it arrived in 1854, this was the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, chartered to build from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Many railroads were chartered in the 19th century with grandiose plans and expectations, but they often failed to reach those aspirations. But this one did, going west out of Madison and arriving in Prairie du Chien in 1857. So within a decade of statehood, Wisconsin had a railroad running all the way across it. And like many early railroads, it connected waterways. Both of its endpoints were major ports with dense populations and heavy industry. This is an 1854 drawing of Milwaukee with ships quite prominent in Lake Michigan. And this is Prairie du Chien in 1870 with both steamboats and the railroad featured at bottom middle. Now, visible at upper right is the Wisconsin River, whose broad and gentle valley was a natural path for the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad as it went west of Madison. It also provided proximity to the lead mines that were a big part of the regional economy and had been long before the first European settlers arrived. Now, since this was the first railroad to cross the state, I'm going to share a few more photographs of it before moving on. So a mile west of the Madison Depot, the railroad crosses University Avenue, and this is it in 1958 as a freight train heads west. At the center is the stack of the UW power plant, which was coal-fired and rail-served into the mid-2010s. The two-story brick structure at far right is the Material Science and Engineering building. Continuing west, this train is passing the Middleton Depot at Parmenter Street in 1982 when the Osborne Company still stood next to the tracks. The 1895 depot remains, but everything else in this scene has been redeveloped. This train is leaving Cross Plains on Halloween in 1975. There's been a lot of new development here too, but on the left, Saman Lumber is still in business 50 years later. A mile beyond Cross Plains, there's a wonderful overlook at Fesky County Park where I photographed a Wisconsin and Southern train just after sunrise on a winter day in 2021. The incredible hoarfrost that morning was thanks to the cold air and the open water of Black Earth Creek, which the railroad follows. Coming into Mazomanie, the tracks run alongside Lake Marion, which is really a pond fed by Black Earth Creek. It was built in the 1850s, in part to power a mill, but also to provide water for steam locomotives on the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. In town along Broadhead Street, this is a Madison-bound train passing the Mazomanie Depot in 1956. The structure was 99 years old in this picture, built in 1857 and the oldest wood frame depot in Wisconsin. It still stands in 2025 and is home to the Mazomanie Free Library. Now, just before arriving in Spring Green, the railroad crosses the Wisconsin River for the first of 3 times. This elevated view from 2021 shows off the sandbars that are so characteristic of the lower Wisconsin and so detrimental to commercial navigation attempts there. The rightmost of the 3 truss spans was built as a drawbridge that spun on a central pier, but between the sandbars and then the trains, it rarely had to open. I'd love to keep going west, but we have a lot more railroads to see back in Madison. So getting back to Madison in the 19th century, a third line had arrived by 1857, and that was the Watertown and Madison Railroad from Watertown, which ultimately provided a second route to Milwaukee. The Panic of 1857 and then the Civil War slowed railroad construction all over the country, but the next line arrived in 1864, before the war had ended. That was the Chicago and Northwestern, reaching all the way up from Chicago by way of Janesville. This line also crossed Monona Bay, and so it had to cross the tracks that the Milwaukee and Mississippi had built a decade earlier. Now, when 2 railroads cross one another at grade, that's called a diamond because the intersecting rails make that shape. And this spot in Monona Bay became known as the Diamond in the Lake, and it's a pretty unique railroad location. Diamond crossings themselves are common. Madison would eventually have half a dozen of them, some with multiple diamonds. But this might be the only one in the world in the middle of a lake. This is my drone photograph from January of 2022, and this is a wider and higher view with plenty of ice fishermen out trying their luck. The train is on the former Milwaukee and Mississippi, bound for Janesville and ultimately Chicago, and the former Chicago and Northwestern line is on the causeway it left. To the right, along John Nolan Drive, that track reaches the Isthmus. And once there, the Northwestern had to build diamonds with the Madison and Watertown Railroad, which round up right in the middle of Blair Street. Those diamonds are at the upper left of this 1936 Angus McVicker photograph, and the view here looks northeast. Williamson Street and Machinery Row would be just out of frame to the right. Now, railroads are legally obligated to allow other railroads to cross them when they're with diamonds, but the railroad that got there first gets to be in control. And that explains this 1955 scene looking the other way from Blair Street. Here we have a Chicago and Northwestern passenger train that is stopped and having to wait for the lowly Milwaukee Road switcher pulling a few freight cars. The Milwaukee Road got there first, they get to be in control. Now, back in the 19th century, Madison's next line arrived in 1870, when the Madison and Portage Railroad connected those two cities. It joined the Madison and Watertown at East Wilson and Baldwin Streets, and at this point, one of the two major rail systems in Madison was complete. Now, the corporate history of U.S. railroading is an endless series of mergers and acquisitions, and 4 of these lines came under the control of one big company called the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, better known as the Milwaukee Road. With major shops in its namesake city, it became Wisconsin's hometown railroad. The Milwaukee Road built and assembled a dense network throughout the upper Midwest, and then in 1909 they completed their Pacific extension all the way to Puget Sound, later renaming themselves as the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. It even reached the Ohio River at Louisville, Kentucky. Now, the Milwaukee Road's growth into an 11,000-mile system was a two-edged sword for Madison. On one hand, passengers and freight in Wisconsin's capital had far more options within the network of a single carrier, but on the other hand, the Milwaukee Road lines in Madison were ultimately relegated to secondary status. Now, to understand why that happened, let's take a look at the state rail map from 1900. The Milwaukee Road lines are the reddish-orange ones here, and they went almost everywhere in Wisconsin. We'll zoom in on the southern part of the state. Now, I've already mentioned the Madison and Portage and the Madison and Watertown railroads, and many other railroads came under the control of the Milwaukee Road, including one that ran straight between Watertown and Portage through Columbus. It ultimately forms the hypotenuse of a right triangle with Madison at the corner. And remember from geometry class that the hypotenuse is shorter than the sum of the two legs. And now consider that one of those legs, the Madison and Portage, had to climb out of the Yahara River, go over Arlington Hill, and then descend into the Wisconsin River Valley. That required a grade of about 1.5%, which means 1.5 feet of vertical rise for every 100 feet of horizontal travel. Now, that might not sound very steep, but it's about twice as steep as most other railroad grades in the region. Why is that important? Well, the entire enterprise of railroading is based on the very low rolling resistance of a steel wheel on a steel rail. And that resistance increases drastically when you add grades and curves. A locomotive that can pull a 2,000-ton train up a 1% grade might only be able to manage 1,000 tons on a 2% grade, and that's on straight track. Curves reduce that even more. If you're unlucky enough to have a curving 4% grade, you might need 5 engines to pull 17 cars. This picture and the last aren't from Wisconsin, but they do help make the point. Railroads want to be as straight and as flat as possible, and that's important here. Taking the hypotenuse between Watertown and Portage is not only shorter, but also straighter and flatter than going through Madison. Now, all 3 of these lines still exist today, but the ones through Madison now only host local freight traffic, typically just 1 or 2 trains a day. This one is hauling crushed rock from the quarry at Waterloo over the Crawfish River at Hubbleton. But up on the hypotenuse between Portage and Watertown, the trains can be 2 miles long, and some of them run across the continent. This is CPKC Train 148 coming into Watertown on a stormy evening in 2023. It's bound for Chicago, and it came all the way from the docks of Vancouver, British Columbia. Many of its colorful shipping containers carry imports from Asia. Returning to the triangle here on the Milwaukee Road, to the east, the Milwaukee Road tracks run to Milwaukee and Chicago, which became the railroad hub of the entire continent. And to the west, the Milwaukee Road goes to La Crosse, and then up the Mississippi River to St. Paul and Minneapolis, which became a gateway to the Pacific Northwest. By the 1890s, most of the North American rail network was complete. The trains had come to dominate transportation, and the Twin Cities had two different railroads running to the West Coast. The continental US had been complete since the 1850s, and trade was moving across much greater distances, thanks in large part to the railroads. The rail corridor between Chicago and the Twin Cities emerged as one of the most important in the nation. Half a dozen different railroad companies competed fiercely for business in this corridor. The Milwaukee Road had one of the best routes, but it didn't go through Madison. It went through Watertown, Columbus, and Portage. So that's where the long-haul freight trains and the streamlined passenger trains ran, and why they still run there today. This is the Milwaukee Road's flagship train, the Olympian Hiawatha, bound for Tacoma. And John Gruber took this wonderful photograph from atop the railroad's tunnel at Tunnel City, looking west into the hazy bluffs rising toward the Mississippi River Valley. Now, what came through Madison on the Milwaukee Road were primarily regional and local trains, but that's not to say the city suffered from poor service. In the middle of the 20th century, the Milwaukee Road ran 11 daily passenger trains each way between Madison and Milwaukee, as well as 2 pairs to Portage, where they connected with those long-distance trains. There were also 3 pairs of trains that ran directly between Chicago and Madison, and the fastest of them, called the Varsity, made the run in 3 hours flat. This Gruber photograph shows it in 1963 crossing Monona Bay. Going west from Madison, there were also 3 pairs of passenger trains, and at Prairie du Chien, they crossed an incredible pontoon bridge over the Mississippi River to Marquette, Iowa. You can see the open bridge in the background here. That section actually floated on pontoons and trains ran across it. One of the Milwaukee Road trains that crossed this bridge was called the Sioux, and it went all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota. Now, back in Madison, the Milwaukee Road's main facilities were always in the 600 block of West Washington. This is the second depot built there, a 2-story wood building that replaced a smaller structure, and that's an eastward train in front of it. The station included a hotel, which you can see on the sign above the locomotive's headlight. It was typical for city stations to include hotels and other amenities. But as business grew, the railroad needed a larger station here, and so they replaced this one in 1903 with the one we still have today. A neoclassical brick building designed by the Chicago firm of Frost and Granger. A striking feature about the depot for me is that it only had one platform, meaning that only one train at a time could receive or discharge passengers. With all those trains, that must have been a bottleneck, and for decades, the Milwaukee Road had a second depot in the city. It was called East Madison, and it sat at East Wilson and South Franklin Streets. The first structure was built in 1869 and was a pretty simple 1-story affair. This view looks west on Williamson Street, and you can just barely make out the Capitol above the depot. As the city grew, the railroad built larger structures here, including this one, photographed circa 1918, and it was later replaced by a Hipworth depot similar in style to the larger one at West Washington, seen here in the middle of this Angus McVicker photograph. Now, by this time, the Milwaukee Road was calling this station Franklin Street, which came in from the right. That's Blair Street in the foreground, and you can see straight up Wilson on the right. This station lasted until 1952, when the railroad consolidated everything to West Washington. So here it is in a 1956 Gruber color slide with a couple of freight trains out front. The Milwaukee Road's freight traffic through Madison was also pretty substantial, mostly agricultural products and manufactured goods made in Wisconsin, heading to Chicago and connections there with Eastern railroads. One of the biggest shippers in Madison was the Oscar Mayer plant on the east side of town. It was a hive of activity in this 1942 aerial photograph. The view here looks north from Commercial Avenue, and Packers Avenue now runs just to the right of this image. And at upper left, the railroad cutting that diagonal was the line to Portage. We'll head back downtown with another aerial photograph, this one from about 1950. It shows all of the Milwaukee Road's key structures in Madison for both passenger and freight trains. We're looking west here, and that is West Washington, cutting across the lower corner on the left, and then on the lower right corner is the Hotel Washington, which burned in 1996. The new development includes this commemorative plaque. The Hipworth Passenger Depot is right in the middle, and then to the right of that is the baggage claim building that is now the Harvey House restaurant. Now, much of the architectural history of railroading focuses on depots and stations, especially the larger and grander ones. Rightly so, but I am equally fascinated with the more utilitarian and vernacular architecture of railroading. And so let's look at some of that. That's Regent Street at the top middle, and just below it is the Roundhouse. And I think the location of the Roundhouse is the reason that Regent makes that jog right there. The Roundhouse nearly inscribed a half circle, and at the time it had 18 stalls. That's where steam locomotives went to be serviced and repaired between their runs. The turntable in the middle provided easy access to every stall, while also turning each locomotive in the proper direction for its next run. In the upper right corner is the coaling tower, which fueled the steam locomotives, and I think most of you know very little of any of this remains today. The turntable and the Roundhouse are completely gone, and the City Station Shopping Center now occupies the site. Demolition came in stages. In 1983, just 6 stalls of the Roundhouse were still standing. A year later, the freight station was being torn down. This view looks east with the passenger depot in the distance at right. John Gruber even came to see the removal of the turntable, which started in 1986, was still in progress in 1987, and wasn't actually lifted out until 2 days after Christmas in 1988. The turntable has been preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it's stored in hopes of future use. Going back to the aerial photograph, I also want to point out that West Washington crossed no fewer than 12 tracks. There's just one there today. The only visible protection is a pair of Griswold signals with rotating stop signs and flashing lights there in the middle of the street. There are no gates, despite exponentially more trains than there are now. There was, however, manual crossing protection in another piece of wonderful vernacular architecture just out of view to the left of this frame, but we see it here on the right, this elevated watchman's tower. And this is a 1963 Gruber photograph from a locomotive cab. On the left is the former Kroger warehouse with 3 boxcars on its spur track for unloading. For the photographer lucky enough to be allowed upstairs in that tower, it offered a commanding view. This is a Milwaukee-bound passenger train getting ready to pull out in the winter of 1956. So that covers the Milwaukee Road. Now let's take a look at their main competitor in Madison, the Chicago and Northwestern. We already touched on the Northwestern's first line into Madison, the one coming up from Chicago, which arrived in 1864 and made that diamond crossing in Monona Bay. By 1873, the railroad had extended that line north and west to Baraboo, Reedsburg, and beyond. It crossed the Wisconsin River at Merrimack, where we see a streamlined passenger train rolling across the bridge in 1960. And it also ran along the eastern shore of Devil's Lake, seen here with a steam-powered passenger train in 1952. The railroad played a key role in developing tourism here. Now, to tap into the agricultural bounty of southwestern Wisconsin, in 1881, the Northwestern built a line west from Madison to Dodgeville, Platteville, and eventually Galena, Illinois. It split off from their Chicago line at Olin Avenue near the bottom of the map here. And then finally, to compete all the better with the Milwaukee Road, in 1882, the Northwestern built its own line between Madison and Milwaukee through Cottage Grove and Lake Mills. So at this point, in less than 30 years, the 2 biggest railroads in Madison had fully staked their claims to the city. Now, unlike the Milwaukee Road, Madison was very much a mainline stop for the Chicago and Northwestern. Its routes appear here in dark blue. Northwest from Madison, the line extended to Elroy, where it connected with a subsidiary that ran through Black River Falls and Eau Claire to St. Paul. And as trade between the Twin Cities and Chicago grew, traffic swelled on the line through Madison. The railroad built a freight yard and locomotive shop on the east side of town to help handle this business. Their roundhouse was just north of East Johnson Street at Fordham Avenue, and part of it still stands and is home today to Apex Property Management. Now, the Northwestern had wanted to work with the Milwaukee Road on a Union passenger station, but the Milwaukee wasn't interested. They wanted to have their own. So the Northwestern built its own passenger station at Blair and Williamson Streets. I haven't found a photograph of the first one, but this postcard shows the second, built in 1885 with a hotel and restaurant inside. The current structure dates from 1910 and was the Northwestern's response to the Milwaukee Road's 1903 depot at West Washington. The Northwestern used the same architecture firm, Frost & Granger, who was also working on a new terminal for the Northwestern in Chicago. And those two Northwestern stations, the one in Madison and Chicago, had some intentional similarities, and that is worth noting. Railroads were pioneers of using standard designs to help establish their brands across their far-flung networks. We might now call that franchise architecture, and railroads really pioneered this. By the time of this 1982 photograph, the passenger platforms had already been removed, but you can see them here by that wonderful neon sign in this color slide from 1957. This view looks geographically northeast from Blair Street, although the train is a westward train pulling in, and it's westward because of the way the railroad winds itself across the isthmus. The filthy equipment is a reflection of both the winter weather and the deteriorating state of rail passenger travel in the 1950s, and we'll say more about that shortly. The Northwestern facilities here extended east from the depot at Blair Street and filled most of the space between Main and Williamson all the way out to Baldwin. This 1955 photograph looks west from Livingston with the Capitol in the background. And I have to point out that in contrast to that dirty passenger train in the last slide, these freight diesels are new and shiny. Now, perhaps the least remarked of the city's depots was South Madison, which was on the main line to Chicago at Lakeside Street, right across the tracks from where the coffee house is today. I still need to learn more about this depot, but if you've seen the building with the big fish mural, this station sat right in front of that. So all of the point to make about the Northwestern beyond here, though, is that all of their trains going through Madison had challenges to the northwest due to topography. To get to the bridge at Merrimack, seen here with the 1965 circus train from Baraboo, the Northwestern climbs away from the Yahara River and then descends into the Wisconsin River Valley by going over Dane Hill. And this line has steeper grades and sharper curves than most others on the Northwestern. And that's the second time I'm making this point. The local geography and regional traffic patterns put Madison's rail lines at a disadvantage. As business boomed and the trains became heavier, they really had to slog to get over this line. This is the circus train again, climbing Dane Hill just south of Lodi. In the early 20th century, the Chicago and Northwestern was a successful and wealthy railroad company, and you can bet its board of directors envied the Milwaukee Road with its straighter, flatter, shorter line through Columbus. So they decided to build their own brand new 140-mile railroad between Milwaukee and Wyville. It was nicknamed the Adams Line since it passed through Adams and it became an important stop on this route. Compared to the line through Madison, the Adams Line is much straighter and flatter, cutting a hard diagonal across the landscape. This map shows all of the Chicago and Northwestern lines in Wisconsin in 1910. This was their original main line from Chicago to the Twin Cities through Madison. The proposed Adams Line is shown here, and once it opened in 1911, the long-distance trains could now take this route through Milwaukee instead of Madison. And for the next half century or so, the Northwestern used these two lines pretty evenly, so service in Madison remained high. In the 1950s, the city had 5 trains to and from Chicago, and 4 of them continued to the north and west, some going as far as Duluth, Minnesota, and Rapid City, South Dakota. And there were also local trains to and from Milwaukee. And like the Milwaukee Road, the Northwestern ran long freight trains through Madison, mostly on the main line between Chicago and the Northwest. This one is down near Oregon. And the branch lines to Milwaukee and the Southwest also had daily freight service. So that covers the Northwestern. There's one more principal railroad in Madison, and that was the Illinois Central. And whether in terms of trackage, business, or service, it was a distant third compared to the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago and Northwestern. This was a stub branch line that came north out of Freeport, Illinois, where it connected to the Illinois Central's main line between Chicago and Iowa. The Madison branch was built between 1886 and 1888 as the Chicago, Madison, and Northern, although it never went north of Madison, and it only ever had local service. It did have nice facilities in Madison. The IC built their own passenger and freight stations just on the other side of West Washington to the northeast of the Milwaukee Road Depot. And this is the passenger station in a view looking west from Main Street. Just beyond the covered passenger platform is where the tracks cross West Washington. And then the freight station is just beyond that. It closed in 1974, and today it's part of U-Haul. Before that, it served briefly as the Carter Presidential Campaign Headquarters, as well as the home of Felton Sports. The passenger station was torn down in 1944, though. A mixed-use building now occupies this site, with a CVS at ground level and condos above. But if you look closely, in a nod to the past, that building is called the Depot. Now, passenger trains made a relatively early exit from the Illinois Central and Madison, but freight service continued into the 1990s. Traffic volumes were pretty low, though, as this three-car train attests. But the line is noteworthy for its earthworks, including the Stewart Tunnel near Belleville, Wisconsin. Back in Madison, the Illinois Central had to cross the Milwaukee Road with a diamond located just west of Park Street. The view here looks west with a short IC train on the left, waiting for the Milwaukee Road train on the right to get out of the way. So that completes the Madison rail map. Railroads had profound economic and cultural impacts on the city and the region, from the everyday movement of people and freight to the special events that brought crowds to the tracks. Like those circus trains that ran between Baraboo and Milwaukee, this one is topping Dane Hill in 1967, going slowly with everyone standing on the tracks, which they should not be doing. And even whistle-stop campaign trains, like the one Gaylord Nelson and Bronson La Follette used for their 1968 election. In the days when railroads went seemingly everywhere and touched almost everything, a steel boulevard of 4 tracks ran along Lake Monona, two for the Milwaukee Road on the right, and 2 for the Chicago and Northwestern on the left, where we see a train heading to Chicago. When Monona Terrace was finally built here in the 1990s, it was based on a design by Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright had made a series of designs for Monona Terrace dating back to 1938. All of his designs, up through the last one in 1955, called for a Union Station here, but that didn't come to pass. For more than a century, railroads were icons of industrial might. This powerful image of the Milwaukee Road coaling tower in Madison ran in the 1950 Wisconsin historical calendar. But as we already know, this era did not last. The decline of Madison's railroads follows a national story. Railroads were far and away our most important form of transportation through World War II in the 1940s, but that had changed by the 1950s in a sharp decline that continued through 2 decades. And this was most visible to the public in 2 ways. First was the wholesale shift from steam to diesel power. Diesels required far less maintenance than steam locomotives, meaning fewer railroad workers and less railroad infrastructure. The Northwestern demolished their coaling tower near Commercial Avenue in 1957. And second was the loss of passenger trains. The Milwaukee Road stopped running the Sioux to South Dakota in 1960 and closed its pontoon bridge over the Mississippi River the following year, turning that line into a freight-only stub that ends in Prairie du Chien. The view here looks south from the Highway 18 bridge as one of the last trains rolls across in 1961, while Wyalusing State Park is on the bluffs in the background. The Chicago and Northwestern also ended its passenger service to South Dakota in 1960, cutting back their train to Minnesota, and that lasted for just 3 years, and the Northwestern then abolished the train altogether in 1963. This is John Gruber's photograph of its last run at the Madison Depot. Milwaukee Road service held on for a little bit longer and even included football specials that brought fans from Milwaukee into Madison for Badger games. This one is arriving on East Wilson Street on November 9th, 1968, and yes, the tracks ran right down the middle of the street. That was common for trolleys, but it was rare for full-scale railroads, although a few examples do remain in use in the U.S. today. Both the railroads and the cities were eager to eliminate these, and Madison's street trackage is long gone. The houses and trees are still there, but you'd never know a railroad used to be. This is the same spot, the 1300 block of East Wilson, in the spring of 2022. Back in 1968, the Badgers were terrible. 2 consecutive seasons without a victory. On this day, they lost to undefeated Ohio State by a score of 43-8. Madison's football fortunes started to improve in the 70s, but not its rail passenger service. The last passenger train left town on April 30th, 1971, when the Milwaukee Road's Varsity pulled out of West Washington on its final run to Chicago. A lot of freight traffic also left Madison during this time. The Northwestern would send all of its long-distance freight trains up to the Adams Line. This is one of them at North Lowell in 1978. Union Pacific still runs freight trains between Chicago and the Twin Cities over this route. While most of the Northwestern tracks in Madison are still in service today, all of these lines were cut back to stubs. Part of the main line to Chicago is now out of service south of Oregon, and northwest of Reedsburg, the tracks are gone. The line to Milwaukee remains only as far as Cottage Grove, and nearly all of the tracks that once reached into southwestern Wisconsin are gone. Only a short piece of that line remains south of Olin Drive for just a couple of customers. Now, the most obvious cause for rail's decline in Madison and across the country was technological. Cars, trucks, buses, and airplanes all emerged in the early 20th century and matured rapidly, especially after World War II. While each of them is better suited to certain transportation needs than trains are, trains still have many advantages. This is North Shore Drive in Madison in 1961. Now, trains were disadvantaged by a number of public policy decisions, perhaps none more prominent, the interstate highway system. Significant federal, state, and local funding helped build and continues to maintain our highways and airports, while railroads have to pay for the maintenance of their tracks and also pay taxes on them. Now, we cannot overlook the fact that railroads benefited mightily from federal and state land grants in the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th century, public policy had shifted, putting the railroads at some significant disadvantages. U.S. railroads also occupy an odd place as private corporations that provide essential public services. Most are classified as common carriers, and part of that means they have an obligation to provide transportation, even when it means running a money-losing one-car train like this one, crossing the Wisconsin River at Sauk City. Now, due in part to their own greed as well as a lack of competition, the railroads had been regulated heavily during their heyday in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is a stereo card from that era showing the Milwaukee Road Bridge at Wisconsin Dells. It was taken by renowned Wisconsin photographer Henry Hamilton Bennett. But even as the railroads faced new competition from cars, trucks, and airplanes, those old regulations remained in place. This is the circus train crossing Blair Street in Madison, where the competition waits on the left. Another challenge for the railroads is that they had dominated transportation for so long that their leaders, both in labor and management, failed to recognize the extent of these new threats until it was almost too late. Once considered too big to fail, railroad companies fell like dominoes. The many bankruptcies included the Milwaukee Road in 1977, whose once proud facilities at West Washington had become a sad sight. But then relief came in three forms. First was Amtrak, created in 1971 to take over most long-distance passenger trains, relieving the private railroads of their obligation to provide what were, by then, money-losing services. This is the Empire Builder at Wisconsin Dells in 2023 with some of the best fall color I've ever seen there. A second was Conrail, a government-owned railroad that salvaged several bankrupt railroads in the Northeast. And third was deregulation with the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. Now, we often think of deregulation as a conservative initiative, but the Staggers Act passed a Democrat-controlled Senate by a vote of 91-4, and President Jimmy Carter signed it into law. The act allowed railroads to set their own prices, which encouraged innovations like truck trailers or on flat cars, as well as single commodity unit trains, both seen here at Horseshoe Curve in Pennsylvania. Now, these three actions, Amtrak, Conrail, and deregulation, helped start a railroad renaissance that spanned 4 decades. Deregulation also made it easier for railroads to abandon or spin off unprofitable lines, and that's what happened to most of the lines in and around Madison. Under the guidance of its bankruptcy trustee, the Milwaukee Road pared back its system. The most significant cut was its entire Pacific extension, but more important here were many secondary and branch lines. Those included the first railroad through Madison, the Milwaukee and Mississippi. And at the same time, the Illinois Central, which by then had become the Illinois Central Gulf, wanted to abandon its line to Madison. The state stepped in to purchase these lines and maintain local freight service on them, although this got off to a rocky start. The sad condition of these lines did not help matters. The state initially used a few different operating companies. One of them even brought back the name Chicago, Madison, and Northern, with a pretty nice logo. But like all of them, it was short-lived. All of these operators were bankrupt by the end of 1984. A new company called the Wisconsin and Calumet then took over and did a little better, although it would close the former Illinois Central due to its poor condition and lack of business. But still, the Wisconsin and Calumet, or the Wicket, as it became known for its initials of WICT, found success. And then, like a lot of other upstart companies, it was acquired by a bigger one. Bill Gardner's Wisconsin and Southern, which is the primary railroad in Madison today. This is my drone photo from October of 2023 with a train crossing the Yahara River on the former Chicago and Northwestern track. The Tenney Locks are in the background at upper left, and that's the Milwaukee Road, now a trail, at lower right. And as the Wisconsin and Southern succeeded, it looked to expand. And that included leasing all of the former Chicago and Northwestern lines, including the one along Devil's Lake, seen here from the West Bluff Trail, as well as the former Milwaukee Road from Madison to Watertown. As the Wisconsin and Southern grew and thrived, it also attracted attention. And in 2011, Gardner sold it to Watco, a Kansas-based firm with dozens of railroads. Their corporate colors are black and yellow, so I am glad they have continued to use Wisconsin and Southern red here. This train is crossing the Wisconsin River at Lone Rock in September of 2025, taking 130 empty grain cars to the United Co-op elevator in Boscobel. The only railroad in Madison that isn't part of the Wisconsin and Southern is the former Madison and Portage, which the Milwaukee Road never abandoned. Over 40 years of corporate mergers, it became part of the Soo Line, then Canadian Pacific, and now CPKC, which sends a local freight down from Portage a few times each week, and this is one of those passing Goose Pond near Arlington. So that rounds out the current railroad scene in Madison. The Wisconsin and Southern's base is the former Northwestern Yard at Johnson Street. Local freight trains run several days a week on each of the remaining lines here, and their cars then get combined into a big train that departs most mornings around sunrise, bound for Janesville and then ultimately Chicago. Here it is on a summer morning in 2020 as a pair of mallards take flight at lower left. The railroaders call this location MX, which is short for Madison Crossing, and it has one of the newest pieces of track in the city, that curved connection that follows John Nolan Drive, taking the train from the Chicago Northwestern line onto the Milwaukee Road. Now, Madison still doesn't have passenger trains, but 30 miles northeast in Columbus, the main line does. Amtrak's Empire Builder stops every day on its cross-country trek between Chicago, Portland, and Seattle. In 2024, Amtrak actually added a second train on this route. The Borealis runs between Chicago and St. Paul, and despite some equipment challenges, it carried more than 200,000 passengers in its first year of service. That beat most projections by more than 30%. Looking back at the historic rail map, most of these lines remain, at least within Madison proper, but consolidation led to some redundancy, and that created some new opportunities. Wisconsin and Southern didn't need two lines across the isthmus, so today part of the Milwaukee Road is now the Capital City Trail. And across town on the west side, after the Illinois Central branch had been abandoned, it became the Southwest Commuter Path. And here it is from Spooner Street. On the left, a train leaves town in the 1970s, and on the right, cyclists pass in 2022. The Rails to Trails movement has roots in Wisconsin. 3 rail trails converge in Elroy, all on former Chicago and Northwestern lines. They include the nation's first rail trail, the 32-mile Elroy-Sparta Trail, which begins 2 blocks north of the depot and has 3 tunnels. Back in Madison, the Southwest Commuter Path is busy every day and can get downright crowded on a Badger game day. One of railroading's many and most visible legacies in south central Wisconsin is the region's outstanding trail network, much of it built on abandoned railroads. We even have 2 rail trails that cross one another in Fitchburg. In this 1975 scene, we have an Illinois Central train leaving Madison and going over top of the Chicago and Northwestern. And here it is in 2022. The Northwestern is now the Cannonball Path leading toward the horizon, and then the Military Ridge Path coming out of the frame. And up top, the Illinois Central is now the Southwest Commuter Path to the left and the Badger State Trail to the right. I miss the trains, but I'm glad these corridors still exist, and I've had some nice rides on all of them. This photo of the Capital City Trail is a little drab, but I wanted to line it up just as closely as I could with the John Gruber photograph. Keep your eye on the spire of St. Patrick's Catholic Church. Here's John's photograph with a Milwaukee Road freight train on what's now the trail and a Northwestern passenger train at the station behind it. The view looks southwest at the Blount Street crossing. And here's a side-by-side comparison. It's kind of a shame the MG&E office now blocks the Capitol, but that is a frequent challenge of then and now photography. So as our archivist at the center have finished digitizing John's black and white negatives, I've done several comparison shots. This one is back at the depot at West Washington in the 1970s when the crossing guard tower still stood. And here it is in 2022 with only one remaining track and the coal center looming large in the background. Turning around, here's John's view looking the other way from the depot across West Washington and with the Kroger warehouse at left. And my comparison shot from 2022 with new condos in the distance and the GHC parking lot on the right. I stood in that parking lot for this view, looking back at the depot, and I did this shot so I could compare it with this one, a Tom Mickelraith photograph from 1968. He caught 3 Milwaukee Road trains in one shot here. There's a freight train at far left, a local switcher in the middle, and then at right, that's a football special pulling in from Milwaukee. You can even see the Hotel Washington just above that locomotive. I've lived in Madison since 2011, and I've never seen 3 trains in the city at the same time. But there are still trains in Madison, even when they haul only freight. Every carload moves as much as 2.5 semi-trucks. In Madison and south central Wisconsin, the railroad's imprint is deep, its legacy is long and ongoing. Thanks so much for the chance to share some of it with you today.